Hi, I'm Damon Centola. I'm a professor of communication, sociology, and engineering at the University of Pennsylvania. I want to talk to you today about a few ideas from my new book, Change: How to Make Big Things Happen. This book is not only about individual behavior change, but about how new behaviors spread through our social networks and our societies. I was interested in these ideas when I was fairly young. I grew up in a community of artists and activists, and I saw lots of change initiatives start out. As I grew older, I saw that some of them succeeded and spread really quite far, while other ones failed. And when I started grad school, I realized that I could combine the study of sociology with the study of physics to use the methods of the natural sciences to understand these processes of social change. And what we've seen in the last decade is the blossoming of new fields of computational social science and network science, which really help us to not only understand and even predict the spread of social change, but even figure out ways where we can intervene to grow social change more effectively. One of the key ideas with this new science is to move beyond studying people just as individuals and to start studying them as collectives. So if you look at the school of fish, you can imagine taking fMRI scans and studying each of these fish individually. And the question is, if you did that, could you ever predict or anticipate the collective behaviors they exhibit as a whole? And people are the same way. If you want to understand how social movements grow, how new technologies spread, how social innovations take off, really how society changes, you need to understand how collectives interact and how that process works as a whole instead of just trying to study people individually one at a time. And the key way we do this today is by looking at social networks and how the structure of interactions among people governs the spread of behaviors between them. And there are two key features of social networks we tend to look at. We look at people who are very highly connected, who tend to occupy the center of the network, who we call influencers. And we look at people on the periphery, or the edges of the network, who are more modestly connected, and their connections tend to sort of be clustered together in strong ties. And when we think about social change, we tend to think about the influencers as having several key advantages. One is that because they have so many contacts, they discover new ideas early on. And second, because they discover these ideas, then they can adopt them and spread them to lots of other people. And when we think about any kind of change process, this is our basic theory of diffusion. And we've had this same theory for almost a century, that change initiates with someone who's highly connected at the center of the network. They influence the people around them. Those people influence the people who they're connected to, and it spreads from the center of the network to the periphery. So that theory is compelling and it's intuitive and it makes a lot of sense. The problem is that the new data we've collected and new science we've developed shows that this theory doesn't really explain what happens when change processes succeed. A good example of this is the Arab Spring. There's excellent data from the growth of Arab Spring in Egypt, and what the data show is that change initially took hold in the periphery, or the outer edges of the network. And instead of jumping to the center and spreading from there, it actually cascaded around the edge of the network and really didn't grow to the middle of the network until the end of the cascade process. And so what's going on here is that when social change is risky or difficult, the person at the center of the network, in addition to having access to that idea early on, they also have lots of people paying attention to them. So essentially, someone who's highly connected has to worry about the status quo and has to worry about how their ideas will be perceived, how they'll be judged, and ultimately whether they'll be commented on and viewed negatively if they adopt something early on that winds up not succeeding. Whereas people in the periphery of the network, like the network on the right, have many fewer contexts. So if just a couple people adopt, that provides a lot of social reinforcement for a new idea, and they can coordinate with those people to spread it to others. In fact, when we look over the history of social spreading and social change, back all the way to the 1970s, there are enormous numbers of examples of institutional change and the growth of technologies. And of course, now with online data, we have even more evidence that this is actually how social change spreads, not just offline, but of course online as well. And so this raises a kind of a central puzzle for thinking about social change and social networks, which is, does change spread from the center of the network outward, or does it spread from the periphery inward? And so I want to talk about that, and many of these ideas are explored in my book, and I want to talk about a new concept that allows us to use this idea to think about how to target social networks. And so the way to think about this really is, where is the center of the network? Is the center of the network with a highly connected person who's located in the center of this figure? Or is the center of the network actually where we think the periphery is? And is that why social change spreads so effectively? So I'm going to take you through this idea, and I'm going to try to show you that really there's a new concept of centrality that this work uncovers. And there's 3 steps to get there. First, I'm going to describe the difference between simple contagions, like diseases and information, and complex contagions, which are real behavioral changes. Once we understand that, I'm going to show you how understanding simple and complex contagion helps to redefine where the center of the network is. And then once we see this, then we can actually come up with new strategies for targeting people in the network based on this idea of complex centrality that is incredibly effective for initiating social change. So part 1 is contagiousness. Really, a good way of thinking about this has to do with all of the issues we've seen over the last year and a half unfolding in the world around us. Basically, we've seen that the novel coronavirus has spread incredibly effectively across national boundaries, across political boundaries, and across socioeconomic groups, whereas face masks haven't, right? Face masks have been constrained within certain political groups and within socioeconomic groups. And so there's a conspicuous difference between the spread of a pathogen, or what I call a simple contagion, and the spread of behavior change, which I call a complex contagion. So the way we typically think about contagion really is with respect to simple contagions. We think someone's infected and they have a bunch of contacts. One of their contacts becomes activated as a result of their infection. And then that person then infects the people around them. So this is how we talk about the measles and COVID-19, but it's also, of course, how we talk about information spreading, like viral videos and gossip. But there's a couple of key assumptions that are being made when we talk about simple contagions. First of all, it's that contact equals transmission. And that's important because it means that we're assuming that people don't have any resistance at all. And of course, that's true for a contagious pathogen. But for a behavior, we're assuming that it's as easy as being exposed to it. In other words, exposure equals adoption. But oftentimes when we're looking at technologies or innovations that are unfamiliar or that contradict existing social norms, people are self-conscious about the other people around them and what they think of their behavior. So look at this person in the center. Obviously, they have one person who's adopted, who's telling them about an innovation, but the rest of their social network hasn't adopted. And so those people are countervailing influences that are kind of convincing them that maybe they shouldn't adopt this because no one else they know is. Think about face masks like this. So they may know one person who's wearing face masks, but if no one else in their network is wearing face masks, they may wait before doing it so they don't seem odd or somehow deviant in their group. Now a second person may adopt, and that still might not convince them. And finally, when a third person adopts, now they may be convinced and adopt themselves. And so this is the case for all complex contagions. Typically, it's not just that we need multiple contacts, it's that we're sensitive to the people who aren't adopting, and so we need a significant fraction of our neighborhood to adopt before we'll be convinced. And what's going on here is that we're fundamentally resistant to behaviors that are uncomfortable or difficult, obviously that are costly or expensive. But really, any situation in which there's an issue of credibility or legitimacy, we look to our social network and fundamentally want reinforcement for new ideas before we'll adopt them. So now I want to show you what this means for thinking about where the center of the network is. So when we look at social networks classically, what we do is we say, oh, there's people with different measures of centrality. We used eigenvector centrality, betweenness centrality, closeness centrality, degree centrality. You get the idea. There's lots and lots of different measures, in fact, dozens of them. And all of them fundamentally assume that we're spreading simple contagions. So one of the questions is, how effective are they for spreading change? And we ran a study in which we took all the networks from Ad Health, and we tried all of these different seeding strategies for identifying influencers and spreading complex contagions. And then we decided to apply this idea of complex contagion to identify a new kind of centrality, which we call complex centrality, which would be a person who actually wouldn't be very good for spreading a simple contagion, but very effective for spreading a complex contagion. And when we evaluated the effectiveness of complex centrality, it was remarkable. Almost the entire population became activated just by choosing this seed node. So this is using the same model and the same network, but just choosing a different location to seed the innovation. And we ran over 400 of these trials with lots of different networks, lots of different empirical diffusion cases. And we found in every single case that none of the measures that we typically use for centrality could ever reach above 70% of the population, whereas complex centrality regularly reached above 70% of the population. And so what I want to show you is once we understand this sort of new idea of how complex contagions spread, it gives rise to a very specific and mathematically identifiable concept of centrality that helps us to think about who we can target to spread complex contagion. The classic question, of course, is where's the influencer? And the way that we think about this is who can we target to initiate change? Well, if we're thinking about the spread of a simple contagion, then someone who's highly connected is going to be very effective because they've got so many ties. And this is what it looks like. When they get activated, they activate all of their connections and they activate other people. And it's an accelerating viral process. But the difference is when we move to complex contagions, people have lots of countervailing influences that can convince them not only that they shouldn't do it, but those people can judge them quite harshly. A classic example of this in terms of the failure of the influencer is Google Glass. Google Glass was a memorable, exciting social technology. It was designed to be sticky, and Google specifically targeted influencers, elites within the Silicon Valley community, to adopt Glass, which was a very expensive technology. It was $1,500. And Google's idea was basically that influencers would make everybody else want this product. They would create feelings of aspiration and desire, and more people would flock to it. What actually happened, as most of us remember, was the exact opposite. Glass was basically a cyborg technology. It allowed people to sort of browse the web on their eyeglasses, but also to surveil and record the visual environment. And so people thought not only that it was rude to have people browsing the web while they were in a face-to-face conversation, but also that it violated the norms about privacy, that people felt like they were being recorded in situations where it wasn't appropriate. And in fact, it was so conspicuous and the elite strategy backfired so much that the term glass hole was invented to describe the elites who would wear glass by the regular people who wouldn't. Right? And this was such a big backfire, in fact, that Google shut down the entire product line and its company reputation took a hit. And so in these situations where the social norms in a community go against the sort of thing that the influencer is trying to push, what winds up happening in that case is that although the influencer may have lots of contacts, they're not going to be very successful at convincing those contacts to adopt. And even the few people they do convince also are surrounded by countervailing influences. And so this is really the challenge of changing social norms. And the big insight here is that when it comes to identifying the center of the network, when we look at complex contagions, the center of the network actually shifts out to the periphery. The people who are going to be most influential are people who are clustered together and can coordinate on changing the behavior, not of everyone at once, but just the people in their social group. And so that results in a spreading process in which the behavior cascades through specific channels, through overlapping ties that create reinforcement for the new behavior and legitimacy and credibility within the community. And then once a critical mass is reached, it explodes through the network and takes over the population. This entire process is exactly how tipping points work. The way that tipping points occur is that a critical mass grows in the periphery of the network. People coordinate with each other and they spread through strong ties and wide bridges, reinforcement for a new idea that ultimately changes people's expectations about what other people will do. This process of coordination can't be overstated. It is the fundamental aspect of all social change processes, is that when people need to coordinate with each other, they will start abandoning old behaviors that no longer allow them to successfully coordinate. And so this is true for how Black Lives Matter succeeded, how it moved from a marginal movement in Black communities into a mainstream movement across the United States and then across the world. It's also how marriage equality wound up spreading from marginal communities across the U.S. to change social norms so that the vast majority of Americans now support marriage equality. In fact, it's also how Twitter spread. It took years for Twitter to grow. It had a slow ramp-up phase, ultimately hit a critical mass. It grew exponentially and then spread across the nation and across the world. So for all of these critical mass processes, and in fact for every single social change process we know of, they exhibit this classic S-shaped growth curve, where initially there's slow growth early on, then you hit the tipping point, there's rapid acceleration, and then finally a slowdown at the end. Now, the way historically we've described this process is to attribute it to different types of people. We say that early on, there are early adopters, people who are interested in social change, or technophiles who want to try a new technology. Then once a critical mass is reached, you get regular adopters, your average Joe willing to adopt, and then finally get the laggards, the people who are reluctant to change but ultimately do because everyone else has. And I want to suggest that this conception of change is really wrong. Fundamentally, what this does is this treats change processes and this growth curve as if it's different types of people. And that's what describes this curve. And in fact, that's not what's going on. It's not different types of people. It's different locations in the social network. So early on, what's happening, and the reason the growth is slow, is because social change is spreading around the periphery. And this happens until a critical mass is reached, until that growth is large enough that ultimately reaches a tipping point, and my work has identified this around 25%, that ultimately this triggers the center of the network to become activated. And this is when influencers adopt. And it spreads very quickly from the influencers through everyone else because a critical mass has already been reached. And at the end of the process, this is when it reaches all the different parts of the network, the unstructured periphery. And so now we can look at this process in terms of the exact same figure you've seen already, where if you use complex centrality, you can target a cluster within the edge of the network where people can reinforce each other's support for a new idea. When this succeeds, the cascade doesn't just explode everywhere at once. It spreads across these sort of reinforcing ties and grows support until ultimately a critical mass is reached, and then that's where it accelerates across the middle of the network into the rest of the population. And so this gives us a new way of thinking about how do we initiate change and how do we harness the concept of complex contagion to apply it for our own change initiatives. So to bring us back to sort of the punchline here, we can think about these two networks. We've got clear intuitions that say the network on the left is going to be the fast network for diffusion. And for spreading COVID-19 or any kind of simple contagion, that's absolutely true. But if you want to spread not just face masks, but social innovations, new technologies, any kind of social movement or behavior change, the network on the right is going to be the location in the social network where change will take hold most effectively. And of course, this is true for any behavior that's costly or unfamiliar or any social technology that requires coordination. Social reinforcement and networks of strong ties with wide bridges between them are typically necessary for spreading this kind of behavior change. And so this really gives us a new way of thinking about nudges. Typically, when we think about nudges, we think about individual behavior change. We think about ways we can encourage people to make one choice as opposed to another. And we don't typically think about how people are interacting in that process. But I want to shift our thinking when it comes to nudges to thinking about norms. How can we change not an individual's behavior, but an entire population's behavior? And that's really what the complex centrality targeting strategy helps us to understand, is if we target networks effectively, we can actually shift the entire norm of a population all at once and help us overcome some of the resistance we may have or attachment to the status quo that keeps new ideas and keeps innovations from taking hold. And I think this really gives us a new conception of social capital. We can think of social capital very much like financial capital or human capital. Social capital is a resource that we can create by structuring the patterns of connections among people and targeting their social networks effectively. We can cultivate the spread of new ideas and innovations that encourage them to abandon old behaviors and adopt new ones. And fundamentally, we can initiate a process that makes the whole society much more adaptive, much more innovative than it would be otherwise.